Hi, everyone. If you don't know, my name is Willa, and today we're going to start something really, really exciting, and that's CSS. So does anyone know what CSS stands for? You can drop it in the chat. You can drop it in anything.
Isn't it cascading styles?
Yes, cascading. Well, it's cascading style sheets. But yes, you were very close. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So today's lesson is CSS Part 1. So we talked about HTML. That's what we've been doing for the last couple of weeks. So HTML is basically like the bones of our web page, and CSS is like the skin, the muscles, like the physical attributes of our web page. So it's actually what makes a web page look really, really pretty and gives it all of its different style attributes. So what is CSS? We got into this today. We talked about HTML, but with CSS, we can modify colors, font types, font sizes, shadows, images, elements, sizes, everything. If you want to make something look a different way, that's how you're going to do it. You're going to do it through CSS. So how to approach styling, which is what we call coding in CSS. First of all, you want to decide your general style of the website. So what kind of color scheme are we going for? What kind of font family are we going for? What kind of style are we going for? What kind of images do we want to have? All these things. Very important to establish this. Decide the theme. So color, mood, something related to the website. Remember the key elements of graphic design. So good principles of UX and UI, user interface, user experience. What's going to enhance the user experience? What's going to keep people wanting to enjoy the website? So high contrast text and background, make it easy to use. Yeah, don't use annoying colors. Like, don't have yellow text on a white background. Common sense things. And utilize white space for good effect. So selectors. Now we're going to get into the code part of it. CSS. So a lot of times when we talk about code, we talk about syntax, and the syntax is like the special ways we encode instructions to the computer. Well, good news for everyone. CSS has very little syntax, and it's a lot of like whole real English words with just like semicolons and brackets. So it's actually really easy to use. Selectors are used to select which elements you're going to style. So does anyone want to take a guess at which part is the selector? So we're going to take this example, this text box here. I'm going to use my pointer. We're going to take this text box here. What is the selector? The P, the CSS declarations go here, or this line 8 text align center. Does anyone want to take a guess? What is the selector? Have a chat. Yes, it is the P. It is the P. So a selector is the selector is selecting what will be affected by the CSS code. So the selector here gives the style attributes for anything within the brackets. Does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe. HTML. And we have H1. So, but does everyone remember when we had our caret bracket H1 and there was all these words in it and then closing? Well, this cascading style sheets, or the CSS file, is going to link to the original HTML file, the HTML web page. So when we have this selector, the selector P is saying all of the paragraphs, so everything with a P tag, so the selectors correspond to the tags. So everything with a P tag, everything that's a paragraph, is going to follow these set style attributes. So every selector corresponds to the tags in the HTML. So H1 in HTML is the same thing as H1 here. P in HTML is talking about the paragraph, the same paragraph that is being talked about here. So the selectors are the same things as the tags, and they help us to identify, well, it helps the computer identify what is being changed by the styling code here. So can I give it like a real world example? That might help. So say I have a bunch of shapes. I have squares, I have triangles, I have circles, I have diamonds. My selector in that case, So that's my HTML file. My HTML file is squares, diamonds, circles, pentagons. My selector in that case would be triangle. Yes? My attributes here would be triangle color, colon, red. Does that help people? Does that help us understand what that is? Yes, no, maybe, thumbs up, thumbs down. Thumbs up. I'm liking that. That's good. Hopefully that was like a good explanation. Yeah? Okay, I only saw one thumbs up. Maybe, nope, okay, another one. I'm looking through. Is there more questions about that? Do we need to go through it again? Do we want to move on? Okay. Okay, so okay. The general selector is more like an indicator, right? It indicates what the points below change. The selector is more like an identifier for the computer. So the computer, like the selector, it's more just like an identify tag. Like it says like, that's what the ID selector. This is the ID selector. The selector and the ID selector are the same things. Okay, yeah, okay. We're gonna go to the next slide because I think when we see it in the example, it will help us make some more sense of it. So, tags. The tag elements and style in the HTML can be applied to elements, but some CSS will not work for certain tags. Okay, so font style of an image selects the body element. So remember this? This is our selector, and it's selecting the body element. Yes? So here we're calling it tags, but it's the same thing. It's the selector. So the selector selects the body element. Here, we're selecting, the selector is selecting everything that is a table, a TH, or a TD. So everything that has a tag table, everything that has a TH, everything that has a TD. Now, CSS is also kind of smart. So it can be applied to all elements. Like you can do things, but like it's smart in the sense that it won't let you do things that are physically impossible. So this is a great example. If you have an image, so this tag would say IMG because it's an image, and you said font family Helvetica, it would say that doesn't make sense to me because you're telling it that I want you to be font Helvetica, but it's an image, so it knows that it can't be font. Yes, so it works for things that it knows works, which is good because if you're playing around with it, it will tell you what it knows works and what doesn't. Okay? Yes. I know it's a little confusing, but I think the example will help us. So class and ID. The class and ID selectors select elements based on class ID and name. So you have different classes, and we haven't really got into this because this was more something that the advanced group got into, but basically there's classes and there's classes and there's different types of stuff. So these are just some different ones that we didn't really get into. You're not going to be needing them today. If you have questions about them or you want to integrate them to your project, come ask me later. But it's basically the same kind of syntax. So all P elements with the label class. So all paragraphs that are under the label class. And that basically means that all paragraphs that are defined in the class label. So all paragraphs that are labels will have the color gray. It's weird, but it's a way of identifying certain elements in grouping them. So if I have a whole bunch of headers and I want them to all be in like a top like header bar, I would maybe use like a label tag because then I can group them all and use them all and give them all the same syntax without having to write 5 different CSS functions. So it's a really good way of like grouping things together, but our projects so far are not going to be that complex. So you won't need to worry about grouping a bunch of things together because you're not creating web pages with 500 different things on them. So it's an interesting concept, but what's a class label? It's interesting. So which one are you from the before class label? This is class selectors. A class label. No, the question was about class labels. So, okay. You know how you have binders? So like if you go to school or you have gone to school, you know how you have binders and you might have a binder that has your math work, your history work, and your math work and your history work and your science work. Yes, I'm going to use a real world example for this because I think that might be easier. You have a binder with all these different subjects in it. What do you do to divide that work? You use these like plastic divider thingies. I don't know the word for them, but I think they're called dividers. But you use these plastic dividers and they say, okay, all the work from this divider to the next divider is my math work, right? So a class label is basically saying, if we think about it in terms of like the computer, we can say for this example right here, P label, I have a binder and they're full of paragraphs, right? They're full of paragraphs. Every single thing in here is a paragraph. I put a couple dividers in. Instead of having a divider that says all of these paragraphs are math paragraphs, right? We can just say all of these paragraphs are under this label. We don't have to give the label a name. We can say all of these paragraphs are under this label. And then we can take that label and stick it in the CSS and we can say, okay, all of the paragraphs under this label are going to be gray. That's their defining characteristic. Not that they're about math, not that they're about science. Their defining characteristic is that they are gray. So all of the paragraphs in that divider, or also known as label, are gray. Does that explanation help? Does that explanation make sense? I tried to give it a real world example. I saw a chat come up. People basically, yeah, it gives each paragraph an identity. Yeah, and it gives each paragraph the identity, but it gives all of them basically to the CSS the same identity. I'm getting some kind ofs, I'm getting some yes, I'm okay. So I think that might help. I'm going to try and use some more real world examples because I feel like those are resonating, and that's good because it's what about makes sense for you. So we also have pseudo classes. So this is a little bit interesting. You're going to see one in the example today. You don't have to touch it if you don't want to, but you're going to see one in the example today. I put it in. Pseudo classes are selectors used to define the style of an element when it's in a certain state. That's a really long and convoluted sentence, right? Okay. So let's take our example that said, remember our binder that had all the paragraphs in it, and we had our label, and our label said all of these paragraphs are gray, right? We got that. So now we have this binder full of paragraphs, and some of those paragraphs are gray. Now we're going to say, okay, all those paragraphs that are gray, when we put our mouse over them, they're going to change color. So you're taking that class of all of the paragraphs that were gray, and you're saying, when this case happens, when my mouse hovers over these paragraphs, I want them to change colors. So it's a very like if statement, right? So it's a good example of an if-else statement, which is something you're going to see a lot in Java and JavaScript. These paragraphs are gray. If my mouse is on these paragraphs, they are red. So they change color, they become red. Else, my mouse is not on these paragraphs, they are the same color, they are gray. That's a really tricky example, but we're going to look at it visually here. So dot label, we have our label, all these paragraphs are gray, well, change their color. all these paragraphs are blue, right? When we hover over all of the paragraphs in this label with our mouse, that's what this means. When hover, that's what this means. They change their color to gray. Yes? So all of these paragraphs, yes, all of these paragraphs are under this label. When my mouse goes over these paragraphs, they change their color to gray. That is a pseudo class. A pseudo class is a class for a special case. Yes, no, maybe on the explanation. Yes, no, maybe on the explanation. I saw there was a chat. I'm going to look at the chat. I know in MATLAB you need to use the else if conditional, but it does apply to CSS too. No, it does not apply to CSS. CSS, you just have like a cascading, like, so this is the dot label colon special case. The special case here is the hovering. So the special case here is the hovering. That's the syntax. There's no if else. That's not in CSS. That's in Java, and that's in JavaScript. We'll get to that in 3 weeks. Don't have to worry about that for now. But that's where it's at. I saw some thumbs up. I'm really glad that we're getting this. I know it's a tricky concept. Okay. So attribute selectors. I know a lot of selectors. It's crazy. It's a lot of things. But think of it as we want the computer to do exactly what we want it to do, and having all of these special things to tell the computer what we want to do makes CSS really precise. So attribute selectors select all the elements with a certain attribute. So remember our binder with the paragraphs? Yeah? Okay. So remember our binder with the paragraphs, and we had a label, and that said all of the paragraphs within this label are blue. Not all of the paragraphs in the binder are blue, but all of the paragraphs within this certain label section are blue. The attribute selector, what it does, it looks at your binder, and it doesn't look at one certain time, it looks at the whole binder. It goes through every single page of the binder. And say your attribute selector, your criteria is the paragraph blue? Yes, put it in one pile. No, put it in the other. So it looks at every single page, every single paragraph, and it says, is this blue? If the answer is yes, stick it in one pile. And if the answer is no, it sticks in another pile. According to your attribute selector, it could be, okay, take all of these paragraphs that are blue. Here, you wanted all the paragraphs that are blue to do something with them. I don't know what you want to do with them, but here, because this is all of the things that were under the given attribute, here, do things with them. And then under that, you do things with them. So in this example, we're using images. So this is one without an attribute selector. The one that's on the left is one without an attribute selector. So image height. That's not an attribute. Every single image has height, whether it's 1 pixel or 10,000 pixels. They all have height. Image height equals 500 pixels. That's an attribute, because not every single image is going to have a height of 500 pixels. So what this attribute selector did is it went to our binder full of images. It went to the binder full of images, and it said, okay, let me look at these images one at a time. And if the image has a height of 500, I'm going to put it in this pile. And if it doesn't, I'm going to put it in this pile. Then I'm going to take all of these images that have attributes of 500 height, and I'm going to give them to the person. And the person is going to give me a style element for those specific images. In this case, that the border of these images is 2 pixels and it's gray. Does this mean that it adds a style attribute 500 pixels? No, it doesn't. So it doesn't add a style attribute to the image. It cannot add a style attribute. Well, okay. It adds a style attribute, but it doesn't. So, okay. We have our binder full of images. Not all of these images have 500 pixel height, right? So not every single one of them is going to have 500 pixel height. What the attribute selector does is it takes the ones that fit the criteria. So say we're looking at, okay, say you're at the grocery store and you're in the cereal aisle and you want Lucky Charms. There's Frosted Flakes, there's Cheerios, there's like the wheat brand cereal. You don't want any of that. You want Frosted Flakes, but you don't want to go to the grocery store. So you send the attribute selector to go for you, and you tell the attribute selector, I want Lucky Charms. So the attribute selector goes, and it goes to the grocery aisle, and it looks at all of the cereal. And it looks at every single box. And what it does is it looks at every single box, and it says, are you Lucky Charms? And if the answer is yes, it takes the box, and it gives it to you. And if the answer is no, it leaves the box. Then what the attribute selector does is just gives you all the boxes. That's all the attribute selector does. The attribute selector just gives you everything that fits your criteria. What the CSS under that, though, which is this, line 33. Line 33 is not an attribute selector. Line 33 is the CSS under the attribute selector. So the attribute selector just gave you all of your images that have height 500, gave you all the Lucky Charms. Now, you, writing CSS, tell it that all of the images have 2-point gray. So it doesn't give it anything. It doesn't give it any style elements. It just gives you all of the things that fit your criteria. Yes, no, maybe. I know that there was a comment that said we didn't understand it. Did that maybe help? Does that mean the attribute selector is also looking for that border along with the 500 pixels? No, because borders are not inherent to images. Images do not have a border unless you're given them a border. So this gives it a border, but it doesn't have a border until you give it a border. So the 2 pixels happens after the attribute is done. So once the attribute goes through the grocery aisle and picks out the Lucky Charms, and picks out the image with 500 pixel height, once it found all of those, then it gives every single one of them 2-pixel double gray border. I know it's tricky stuff, and I know it's hard, but you will get through it. Just ask questions when you need to. That's what I'm here for. Does the 2 pixels happen automatically or by the coder? The 2 pixels happens when you tell it 2 pixels. I think you're focusing a little bit too much on the 2 pixels. The 2 pixels, this border is not part of an attribute selector. This line 32 is the attribute selector. Border 2 pixels double gray, that's not an attribute selector. That's just a styling element of CSS. That's what CSS is. CSS is telling the computer what we want things to look like. This could be 10 pixels bright red. This could be 5 pixels navy blue. So RGB, that's a really great question. Okay, yes, some of you have looked down here. RGB is a color code. So basically, if you want to find a color, and this is really useful for CSS, you're going to see this in the example, but you're either going to use a predisposed list of colors, or if you want a custom color, which I suggest you do because they're really fun, you're going to pull up a little color wheel. And this happens in Replit, so be warned. You're going to pull up a little color wheel, and you're going to look, and you're going to drag, and you're going to find a color that you like. And you're going to say, I want that color. And the computer's going to say, okay, and it's going to give you a little square with that color, and it's going to say RGB 3 numbers, or it's going to give you a hex code. RGB stands for red, green, blue, and it's a code that we use to identify like a code that we use to identify colors, because in the computer's eyes, all colors can be made with a certain amount of red, green, and blue. So you know how you have a printer, and the printer has black ink, blue, yellow, and magenta, I think it is? Well, it's basically like that, but with red, green, and blue. So it says, okay, well, this color here has 226 units of red for every 248 units of green for every 255 units of blue. And if we mix that in our little mixing pot, that's what we get. So that's an RGB color code. A hex code, very similar, except I do not understand how hex codes really work. It's a series of 6 letters and numbers that identify colors, just a different system. But yeah, RGB color codes are really interesting. You can play around with them today. There's a few in the example. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, if that's okay with everyone. Yeah. Declaration, property and value. Okay, so a declaration is a line of CSS which makes up the second part of a rule set. Crazy. So that's what we were talking about before. You can have multiple declarations within a rule set. So each declaration has a property, which is then assigned value. So property, value, for multiple declaration per rule set, use semicolons. Okay. That's a lot of coding garbage. Well, not garbage, but coding language. Remember this? Remember our little selector? Okay, so this is a selector. This is an attribute selector. This is a thing. That's not what we're talking about right now. What we're talking about is these three lines: text align, color, and padding. And I want everyone to focus on just these three lines. These three lines are examples of individual declarations. So each line is its own declaration. The three of them are not one. There are three declarations here. Each declaration has its own line. You cannot have two declarations in the same line. What this does is a declaration says, okay, here's my property and here's the value I want to give this property. So it's basically like saying, well, property value. Here's my house and I want to assign it a value of $500,000, right? That's a property, that's a value. Here is my triangle and I want to make it red. Property, value. Our examples here in coding, well, we have three here, and I'm going to go through what each of them mean. Text align. Where do I want my text to be aligned? This is a property you can have in CSS. Do I want my text align to be in the center? Do I want it to be to the left? Do I want it to be to the right? You will have experienced this in Google Docs or Word Docs when you go and you say, do I want my text align to be in the center, to the left, or to the right? That's the example of text line we're talking about. So I say, okay, property, semicolon, the value for that property. So I'm saying I want my text align to be in the center. So that means when my text is on my web page, it will be in the center of my web page. It's not going to be off to the left. It's not going to be off to the right. It's going to be in the center. Before I get any questions about this, yes, it's American spelling. CSS will not recognize Canadian spelling or British spelling. I'm American, so that makes sense for me. But if you're in the UK or you're in Canada or you're in another place that uses British spelling, you're going to have to use American. At least for Replit, at least the version I use. So we're going to do property, colon, value for that property, semicolon. Yes, no, maybe so. How are we? So color. What color do I want my font to be? What color do I want this header to be? Right? Because these apply to this. So what color do I want the header to be? I want the header to be black. Padding. That basically just says, like, it's a weird one, but it's like, how much space do I want around the thing that nothing else can be in? So how much space do I want to devote on either side to that header? And it's 10 pixels. Basically what that does is it draws a little line, and that line is 10 pixels long, and it traces the header around, and it draws a little rectangle around the header, and it's like 10 pixels, the padding. It's a weird one. You don't really have to worry about it now, but it's more for spacing and aesthetics. If you want help with that one, let me know. We can work through it in the example. I see a question. Do the properties have to come into specific text? Like, are there only certain words CSS will cover? Yeah. So there's only certain words that CSS accepts. So like text align is the certain word. Color is the certain word. You can't just say like, you can't say like text color. That's not a CSS word. So these are specific words. They are specific words. You can't just write whatever you want to write. There's specific words. But notice how it's not like weird coding word. Like it's pretty much English, which is generally okay because you can kind of piece together what you want to say by just trying some things out. Property and values. So we're getting to the end here. I know it's a lot. A property is a characteristic that something possesses. So such a color, font, weight, background, or color. Remember the properties we had? Remember these? These are properties. So these are examples of more property. Font weight. You know, how thick is my font? Do I want a really, really skinny font? Do I want a thick font? That's basically the difference in Microsoft Word between regular and bold. By going bold, you increase font weight. By doing regular, you decrease font weight. Background color. What is the color of the background? In this case, purple. Well, it says blue-violet, but it's purple. The value is given to the property not following a colon. Remember, it's a colon, not an equal sign. Very specific. So, a value can be a number that assigns font size or height. Remember, pixels, not in inches, not in feet, not in centimeters, in pixels. And a word that assigns the color of the position of the object. Okay, let's go through this example one by one. Body. All of these are going to apply to the body element in the HTML. For this body element, we want our font size to be 14 pixels. Yes? We want the color of this font. So we want the color of the body to be white. So far we have a body. We have a body. Anything within that body is going to have a size of 14 pixels. It's going to be white, and its background color is going to be purple. Today, this is our project. Before I get into the project, I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quick. So this project is a little bit interesting. It's supposed to be an About Me webpage, and I know that in order to submit this, you have to, or in order to get the certificate, you have to submit your projects. And I want to be very open, so if you don't want to put information out on the web, completely understand that. My challenge for you is to make an ugly web page. So that was one of my first challenges with CSS that they always tell you is like, make an ugly web page. That's what I want you to do. I want you to title it My Ugly Web Page, and you can put whatever words you want on it. I mean, no bad words, like no curse words, but you can make the background color whatever you want. You can make the text color whatever you want, but I want you to play around with it, and that's your challenge. If you don't want to make a web page that's all about me, you're going to make the ugliest web page you can. So now I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go through the example for today. That is CSS. Oh, and I'm also going to put the link in the chat so that everyone can, oops, sorry, so that everyone can get moving on it if you know what's going on and you want to just get on with it. I'll answer fork it first. How do we fork it? We go here and we go fork. Click the little arrow here and we fork. We do not touch this one. We fork. Yes? Everyone's going to fork it before we touch it. All right. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick because I want to give you guys some time to just like play around with it and for you guys to ask me questions. As always, I'll be staying around behind at the end to answer any last minute questions we have. So this is my example. I made an All About Me webpage. It's not super detailed, but you'll get the gist of it. So all about me, I want to tell you all about me. My name is Willa, and some of the things that I like to do is code, bake cookies, and hang out with my dog. And I have an image here of some cookies. What we're really interested here is the style.css. So this is our style element. This is our style.css sheet, and this links to that. So without this file, this would just look like black text all to this side, you know, very boring. But we have some background colors. We have some different font colors. We have this. What is this? Drop it in the chat. Go, go, go. What is this? What is this an example of? I'm hovering my mouse over the list and it changes colors. What is that an example of? We talked about it today. Yes. Yes, Andrea, it's a pseudo class. It's a pseudo class. So, basically, chat. Basically, I'm going to go through this CSS stuff a little bit. Body. Body is like a really large portion of our stuff. It applies to all of our headers, all of our paragraphs. So that's why I just try and make my body stuff pretty general. My background color So you notice how that's the dominant background color of my web page? It's like a nice cream color. See this? See how this is like a really, really ugly thing? It's not an RGB code. This is an example of a hex code. So hex codes are, what I said, 6 digits, letters and numbers. In this case, it's just letters that correspond to a thing. See this? Remember how I said, oh, if you want a custom color, like Replit will help you out with that and give you a little color selector wheel? This is that. So you can go around, you can select different colors, you know, make it all pretty. And that's what this is. This is a color selector wheel that will give you a hex color. Replit does accept RGB codes, but if you're doing the custom color selector in Replit, it's going to give you a hex code. Both of them work, both of them are fine, but I wanted to go over that because there's a lot of hex codes in here. So yeah, let's go over that. So body, font family, Georgia, Garamond, Arial. These are all web safe fonts. So if you have a font and you're like, I want to use that, I would recommend Googling if it's web safe first. And all you do to Google that is you say, is insert font in here web safe? Because sometimes some operating systems don't support certain fonts. Don't ask me why, they just don't. But like a lot of pretty standard ones are going to be supported. So my font family is Georgia, Garamond, Arial. That means if Georgia isn't supported, Garamond. It will go to Garamond automatically. And if Garamond isn't supported, it will go to Arial. Everything uses Arial, like literally everything. So, you know, if you can't think of a font, just use Arial because it will be supported by everything. Margin, 2EM, just gives me my margins on the stuff. And my background color is this hex code color. That gives me all of my style attributes here. Yes? H1, my first header. If we go into the index.html, we have, where's my header? I know I have it. Here. Here's my header. H1, all about me. Right here. Same thing, all about me. So if we go into the style, we see that H1, text align center. What does that mean? My text is in the center of my web page. It's not off to the left, it's not off to the right. Font style, Georgia. That means the font of this is Georgia. The font is Georgia. The color is this custom color hex code thing right here. It's an ugly thing, but you know. And the background color of the header, see this? Notice how it's green. Notice how it's this D2F3DA. That's this color. And that's because you can select different background colors for different attributes. So that's why I have green here, I have a yellow here, I have an orange here, I have blue here. Because I selected different background colors for different parts of my web page. This is my selector. This is my property. This is my attribute. Remember how we were looking at that in the slides? Selector, H1. We're selecting the header 1. The header 1 is going to have the property of text align. Its text align is going to be in the center. Does that make more sense now that we're seeing it in like a real web page? Yes, no, maybe so? Yes, no, maybe so? How do we feel about that? I'm looking at the chat. Yes, good, good, good. I like to see that. I like to see that. Okay, so, just want to make sure that's not a question. How can I change the colors? Excellent question. So I'm just going to use this header 1, for example. If I want to change the color, I'm going to click right here. Notice how it comes up like that. It's a little bit weird, but you have to like hover over it. See, I'm not clicking it. I have it clicked there, but I just hover over it. It's a little finicky. I don't like this, but I hover over it and this pops up. This nice little color wheel. And say I want to change that to like, let's go with red. Red works. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing, but red works. Say I want to change my color to red. See how you have this bar here? It says my old color was this purple, my new color is this red, right? So that's my new color, and it does it automatically. See, it just changed the color code, and if I click run again, now it's red. So you're going to do that with anything you want to change the color of. That's how you change color. Yes, no, maybe so. Does that make sense to people? Okay, so I'm gonna go and talk, because these are basically all the same. There is one thing I want to get into with the images, and there's one thing because this is a new tag that we haven't talked about before. So I'm going to go into that. Image. Display block. Basically, I display it in a single block. Margin left auto, margin right auto with 50%. What do these things mean? This is how you center an image. I know I'm going to get 500 questions about that. You can't just do, you know, margin left auto, margin right auto. As soon as that happens, the margins equalize themselves because the computer wants them to be equal. So as soon as you put both of them at auto, it equalizes them with 50%. Now we're probably looking at that and we're like, that doesn't make sense. Oh, have a good one. Be sure to check out the video. So with 50%, I know we're talking about this and we're like, that doesn't make sense. That's not a pixel value. You're right, it isn't. With 50%, well, that tells us that the image width, so this distance from this corner to this corner, is going to be exactly 50% of the distance from this corner to this corner. Or no, sorry, this corner to this corner. Because we have our padding. Remember our padding? Margin. We remember how we had our margin, 2EM? That's this distance from this to there. So our width for our image is this entire blue block distance, and by saying with 50%, we're saying our image width is 50% of the image distance. I could change that to 25, and it would look like this, right? So I'm going to change it back to 50 because it keeps it big, but that's what that means. And by doing margin left auto, margin right auto, we say, okay, the width is 50%, gives me a given value. And because the computer wants everything to be equal, it's going to equalize it on both sides. So we're going to have a centered image. That's how we center an image. UL and UL hover. These are the pseudo classes. Yes? Does anyone want to tell me what we think UL is? It's an interesting one. It's not one that you would like guess. So I know if we don't have any guesses, that's okay. Does anyone want to guess what UL is? I mean, we're looking at it. We have, oh, this is a background color, and we have a red. What do we think UL is? No, it's not underline. It's not ultimate label. UL is actually list. So if you want to make a list that looks like this with like the bullet points, pretty standard list, you're going to use the tag UL. I'm going to go into my index.html to show you guys. So the tags for list are a little bit complicated. You need two tags. First one, UL. That tells me everything in here is part of the list. Now, if I want to have different items on the list, I can't just do like code, enter, bake cookies, enter, hang out with my dog. That's not how that works. You need to use the LI, opening and closing tag. So we see this, LI. That seems more logically like list, but that's just like a single item in the list. So notice how I have UL, everything in here is a list. LI, item on list. So code, LI, first item on list. Second item, bake cookies. Third item, hang out with my dog. So LI is an item on a list, and UL is encompassing the whole list. It's an interesting one, but it's a fun one to know. Yeah, so the LI is basically the equivalent of a bullet point. Yeah, so it's an interesting one. It's not one that you would like be familiar with. We haven't talked about it yet, but that's a fun one. So UL is our list. Now remember we have pseudo classes, so we have UL hover. So that's our pseudo class. So when UL is hovered on by our mouse, remember here, it changes its color to red. So normally UL is this color, this very dark black color. But when we hover over it, it's red. And that's an example of how we would use our pseudo class. So when something is hovered on, it changes color. Yes, no. So if you want to get going, that's totally fine. I'm going to stay for an extra couple minutes, answer questions, go through some things with people if you want to. And I'm going to stop the recording now. So thank you everyone for coming if you are heading out.